Yeah, when Tim started talking to us about this, I thought it was an incredible opportunity to not only learn from amazing professionals, but also kind of meet as a community a little bit. Sometimes at cons you can do that, sometimes cons are a little busy to get a chance to really network and talk to people. So I was really excited about this and really thrilled that Tim asked us to be involved. I want to go ahead and start by introducing you to the members of our panel up here. And so I'm going to start. They didn't sit in the order that I've got them printed here. It's fine, it's okay. I'll play music, and when it stops, grab a seat. We'll take one off each time. So I'm going to start right down here with Eric Gapster. So Eric is a cartoonist and inker whose work can be seen in comics from DC, Dark Horse, Image, IDW, and Dynamite Comics. His comic strip Wyatt is distributed by Universal Uclick. Let's welcome Eric Gapster. Eric, thanks for being here. Next to Eric, we have Bruce McCorkindale. He is a writer, penciler, and inker. His inks can be found in Rune, Venom, Dinosaurs for Hire, The Nightman, Star Trek DS9. He's worked on several projects with Phil Hester, including Black Orchid and The Wretch. He's revamping his graphic novel, The Falling Man, originally released from Image and Caliber. Bruce McCorkindale, everybody. Next to him is the aforementioned Phil Hester, who's been writing and drawing comics for nearly 30 years. Phil had a long run as the artist of DC Swamp Thing, was the writer and artist of his Eisner Award-nominated series, The Wretch. I'm a high school teacher, trust me, it doesn't bother me at all, do whatever. So no one's broken down crying in the middle of this so far, so I'm already ahead. Oh, well, they will, it's early, but I'm already in third hour by now, somebody's already upset. He's the artist of his Eisner Award-nominated series The Wretch and Drew Kevin Smith's Green Arrow revival. He's the co-creator of Fire Breather and the character El Diablo from Suicide Squad. As an artist and writer, he's worked on books like Wonder Woman, Ant-Man, Nightwing, The Flash Season 0, Deathstroke, and his current Image project, Mythic. Phil Hester, everybody. Cullen Bunn is a writer of comic books such as The Sixth Gun, Harrow County, The Empty Man, and Uncanny X-Men, and numerous Deadpool titles, too numerous to mention here. In addition, he is the author of Crooked Hills, as well as Creeping Stones and other stories, and he's a man who loves hot wings. So Cullen Bunn, everybody. Jeff Corterba is a cartoonist, writer, and musician. His cartoons are distributed through King Feature Syndicate, 400 newspapers nationwide. He has been a finalist for Editorial Cartoonist of the Year from the National Cartoonist Society, and has even had 2 of his cartoons about the Space Shuttle Discovery, which I think is probably the coolest thing in your bio. No offense, everything else is awesome, but that's pretty amazing. So,
can you get me a date?
I'm free later. Jeff Corterba, everybody. Stan Sakai is a writer, artist, and letterer. He was born in Kyoto, Japan, and grew up in Hawaii, and now lives in California. His creation, Usagi Yojimbo, the Samurai Rabbit, was first published in 1984 and continues today. He's received numerous recognitions, including multiple Eisner Awards, the National Cartoonist Society Silver Rubin Award, and the American Library Association Award, and many, many others. The 30th volume of Usagi, Thieves and Spies, was just published in July, and it can be read, and Usagi can be read and enjoyed in 14 different languages. I like the English, that's my preference, but whatever yours is, that's great. It's even used as a textbook on the college level. Ladies and gentlemen, Stan Sakai. Alan Pasalacqua. I've been practicing. Is a professional comic color artist, as well as having been commissioned to create artwork for several national parks. His comic book coloring work includes Batman and Robin Eternal, Justice Society of America, Batman Confidential, Detective Comics, and many others. He's also the ongoing color artist on the Eisner Award-winning Battle Pug. Alan Pasalacqua, everybody. The chances of me pronouncing your last name the same way twice in a row is really vanishingly small, but very good. He told me earlier that his mom is a principal, an elementary school principal, and the kids tried to maybe shift it. They didn't want to say her full last name, so they wanted to call her Mrs. P, and she was having none of that either. A bunch of elementary school kids saying Mrs. P is not is not maybe where you want to go. So I'm going to throw some questions, and obviously you gentlemen have very different backgrounds and different kinds of work that you do. Obviously individuals of you have different things that you do. So I want you to, if I ask a question and maybe it's more tailored to comic books and you would like to shift in another way, please do. We want to learn from your experience, so feel like don't try to shoot on your answer into weird question that I ask. Go ahead and ask the question, answer the question as you feel it'll be most informative for the audience. So I wanted to start, and I'll kind of ask two questions at a time because we'll pass this along and that way we get a little time. But I'd like to know sort of what was your first exposure maybe to comics or to the industry that you work in, and along with that, maybe what do you think is your biggest influence in what you do? What thing was the biggest thing that influences your work? So I'm going to start over here with Eric. No pressure.
So I guess my first introduction to comics and what really just got me into it was Amazing Spider-Man 350. I think you can definitely track it all back to that, reading that comic and just being so blown away by all the fun that was between the covers, and just loved drawing. I loved all the the storytelling just grabbed me in a way that has never really let go, and so from that initial love of superhero comics, getting into more comics, I really fell in love with Calvin and Hobbes, and that's kind of my biggest influence and why I wanted to do this, was I just really loved Bill Watterson's work. So, and then, that world opening up and making the decision that you want to do this for a living, then you start thinking critically about just every artist you see, and so really opened the floodgates there.
So by the time I read Amazing Spider-Man 350, I had grown tired of comics.
Yeah.
That's my difference. I kind of started reading, I think, more humorous comics like Peanuts, Strip, and I like Mad Magazine a lot, and I think I kind of evolved from humor-based comics. I started reading a comic called Not Brand Echh that Marvel put out, and I had never read any of the comics that they were satirizing, and so I became
lost on you.
it was lost, but I loved it. So I got really curious about these comics that they were satirizing, and I think at that same time they were putting out cartoons about the Spider-Man and Fantastic Four. So I think that all sort of led me becoming a really, really heavy Marvel junkie for a while. So I just really got into Marvel comics and just wanted to do them myself. I just started doing comics and have tried not to stop.
But yeah, like everybody else, I started as a fan. I grew up in a small town in Iowa, so comics were sort of this lifeline to a bigger, brighter world, and I'd always liked to draw and I'd always liked to write, so putting those two things together seemed very natural to me, and comics were a natural source of expression, it seemed to me, and I started making comics with my friends in high school, and it was very, very ridiculous, but we put ourselves on schedules and we had like a whole line, we had a humor line and a horror line, but that was good training, and it sort of, I just followed that through line all through my life. I made comics in high school, then through college, and in college actually started working as a pro because it was the time of that black and white explosion. The Turtles came along, and all of a sudden everybody with a credit card was a publisher, and you could find work pretty easily at that time, and I started working then. And I just I don't see any sort of delineation between when I was a kid making comics for myself and myself today, except for I occasionally get paid for it now. And I think probably my biggest influence is Jack Kirby. I mean, when I was a kid and I saw just, not even the way he drew. I mean, I did like that, but just that he was just this unquenchable font of creativity, and that every idea he had, he put on paper, and I felt the kinship to that. So I still feel that connection to Kirby's legacy.
Yeah, I grew up in what I consider sort of a golden era of buying comics, where I could buy a grocery sack full of 50 comics for $5. And every weekend my dad would take me to a flea market, and there's this guy that out of the back of a truck would sell grocery sacks full of random comics. And it was Marvel, usually Marvel superhero stuff, and then some Charlton horror comics. So the stuff I remember the most of. And the only thing I ever bought from that guy was I bought those comics, and I bought a coffin from him once, which if ever you want to talk about that later. But I used to store my comics in the coffin.
That's a long box right there.
Yeah. But I, like Phil, I was making comics when I was very young. In 4th grade, I had a comic series called the X-Laser Knights. Spelled laser completely wrong, but it was very popular. I think we spelled knights wrong too, but I used to give it to all the kids in my class, and they were all stars in the comic. And then I used to go to conventions and print comics in my dad's office and go into conventions and try to sell them for $0.25 a piece. It just took a lot longer for me to actually do it in where I was actually being paid to make comics, because nobody bought those quarter comics I was making. I do. In the coffin. I don't have the coffin. I had to bury someone in it. But yeah, I think you know, biggest influence for me was my dad was always a storyteller. So I think that rubbed off on me very early. I wanted to tell stories like my dad did. I didn't know if I wanted to do it in comics or prose. I didn't care if I was doing it in comics or prose or whatever. I just wanted to tell stories, and it's just always stuck with me.
I started drawing comics before I was born. My experiences are very similar to these guys. I partly blame my father and garage sales. So we would pick up, this is in the 1960s, and he would just buy these boxes of comics, and some of them were quite old at that time, and of course I regret, you know, that those have long since been thrown away, but because he also held garage sales, we would, he was always scouring the paper for good buys, so you know, to buy old TVs and fix them up. So on Saturday night, we would drive to the newspaper, to the Omaha World Herald, to pick up the Sunday paper the night before. So I felt really special. I had the Sunday comics the night before, and I felt like I was a time traveler. And so I would painstakingly copy Snoopy and all the other comics. And my dad was really big on, he was also a musician, he was really big on being unique and being an individual, and he would scold me for copying. And he told me that it was a sin to not be original. So when I was like 6 and 7 years old, I thought original sin was copying Snoopy. So I made up my own comic, and but I had no interest in politics, and as a political cartoonist, I have even less interest in politics now, which I think actually makes me maybe a better editorial cartoonist, just because I'm not some insider and I don't like anybody. So, but my influences in the political cartoon world would be people like Jeff McNally, who also created Shoe, and Pat Oliphant, who was perhaps, he's still alive, I don't know if he's really drawing much now, but maybe America's greatest cartoonist, and he's Australian, but brilliant work. And his work especially spoke to me because he didn't like anyone either, and was able to criticize those on either side of the aisle. So anyway, those would be two people.
I remember buying my first comic book. It was 25 cents. It was a Disney adaptation of Sleeping Beauty, and I bought it at Star Supermarket. I bought Fantastic Four #2 off the racks. DC had just raised the prices to 12 cents. Marvel was still a dime, so I saved 2 cents. And I had the entire run of Fantastic Four from #1 to more than 100 for a while. Yeah. Right now, I think the earliest one I have is Fantastic Four #4, the Submariner. And like so many of these others, I got together with a group of friends and we created our own comic books, our own comic book group, that we had a shared universe. Our characters were intermingle, and we thought that was the coolest thing. We did everything. We bound them in the original artwork. We colored them, inked them, lettered them, and did everything, the entire process. And actually, that's still what I do now. But my big influence back then was Steve Ditko. This is during his Spider-Man, Doctor Strange time, and I love the weirdness of it. And one of the neat things about this profession is that I have got to meet my heroes. I mean, I knew Jack Kirby. I worked with Stan Lee for more than 30 years. I edited the Spider-Man newspaper strip, and I accepted that because that was the only thing that Stan was still writing at the time. So that was the strangest thing. He called me up one day and said, "Hi, this is Stan Lee. I'm looking for Stan Sakai." And I thought, how strange, he sounds exactly like Stan Lee. It was strange. It's like the only other time I ever felt that way was when I met George Takei, Mr. Sulu, and I kept thinking, he actually sounds like Mr. Sulu. It was a strange thing. And I also work with, I've known Serge Aragonés, who did Mad Magazine, Grew the Wanderer, for, I've known him for about 35 years. I found his name in a phone book. And now we're best friends. We've traveled the world together. I also met a lot of my international favorites. I knew Mobius. I met Osamu Tezuka a few times, and went to Japan as a guest of Tezuka Studios. But I love what I do, and I just want to share my love of comics with you guys, and that's the main reason I'm here. So thank you.
Hi, so I grew up in a rural area and a part of California. So I was about 8 miles to anything that resembled a comic book shop or anything like that. So I would beg, borrow, and steal until to get any kind of basically comic out of the trash until I turned 16 and get my driver's license. And then I pretty much blew every dime I had getting those early 90s comics. And kind of just got addicted, started drawing out of the books and trying to match the different artists. And I realized that I really like doing single panels, but I can't do sequential art to save my life. So eventually it turned into, I started doing watercoloring and painting, and then at some point I just ended up doing coloring. And it's kind of like a progression. So I still like to draw, I just don't know what I do professionally. Well, at least not from comics. So that's how I got into it. And then influences-wise, I love all the guys, or people they've talked about, but I think for what I do professionally in comics for coloring, I think some of those early Valiant comics drawn by Bart Sears, and some of the early Image stuff when they really started doing computer comics, because before that, there wasn't much art to it. I mean, there was, but it was more of like paint by numbers and less, actually like rendering and stuff what we do now. So that's kind of where it all started.
I know we have some folks in the audience that are artists, that are maybe creators, that kind of aspire maybe to be able to work in the comics field. And I wrote a quote earlier today on Facebook, and it was, "Pick a job you like and you'll never work a day in your life," because that industry is probably not hiring. So I wanted maybe for you guys to share, was there ever a time where you felt like, or is there still a time where you feel like you didn't know if you'd be able to make it in this industry, and maybe what pushed you through that? Was it a person? Was it an experience? What maybe helped you? Because I think no matter what job you do, there's times where you struggle and you wonder if you're doing the right thing for you. But was there ever a time like that where you had to kind of push through?
It is literally every day. Yeah, I woke up this morning wondering, is this the day? There have absolutely been times when I didn't touch on it before, but I drew comic strips. I think at the age of as a freshman in high school, I decided I wanted to do specifically that. I wanted to draw a comic strip. When you're that young and that untalented, you can look at a Peanuts comic strip and you can say, I can do that. That looks simple. But if you look at you know, a Steve Ditko drawing or a Jack Kirby drawing, that looks like a mystery. I don't understand that. So I'm gonna, you know, kind of take the easy path of least resistance and do comic strips. And I used to joke about that because, you know, this. Sorry if this gets long-winded, but so when I was in high school, I did a comic strip. When I was in college, I did one for the Iowa State Daily, and then come to find out, it's really, really hard business to get into. There, especially at the time I came up, there was, and still, you know, papers just it's not really the not everybody reads newspapers anymore. Comic strips are they've gone from being part of this, you know, social conversation that everybody read, you know, Dilbert and Peanuts, and they're more of a niche market now. So, you know, I never stopped drawing them, but along the way, I mean, I always wondered, especially in 2008 when, you know, when newspapers took a huge hit. But that's when I met Phil, and so that he actually took a look at my work and, you know, asked if I'd ever consider drawing superheroes or, you know, comic books, you know, kind of pull back from that cartooning, and asked if I'd ever considered inking because he thought I had a really great line. And, I hadn't, but I got a really incredible opportunity. His inker at the time, Andy Parks, they were doing a book called El Diablo, and Phil would scan his pages in, and Andy would print them out at his home and ink them in blue lines. So he had all these original pencils from these books lying around, and Phil was really gracious and loaned me about 12 pages, so I got to practice inking on professional work right on top of pencils, which is, especially at the time, unheard of. Most of my guys were practicing using vellum overlays, kind of tracing. So yeah, that's kind of how I kind of came on the path of working in comic books too. But you know, I guess I really don't know where I was going. I just completely lost my train of thought. Now I'm just talking, but so yeah, that's kind of a little insight into that question.
I was doing comics full time from the 90s, kind of late 80s and 90s. I was doing a lot of inking mostly. I remember the first time I actually considered just doing it full time, like not having a backup job. I had a really weird job where I was working it for a while at a church, and if you know me, that's a really weird job. But I was running their offset press, and it was kind of a nice job because it was actually it was sort of between part-time and full-time, so I could kind of make enough money between that and doing comic books freelance. But I remember at the time, it was like around 92, I think, I actually decided, you know, I think I could probably do this full-time in comics, but it was really, really scary. Just the idea was just relying on my entire income for comics I remember it just terrifying. But I think one of the things that's always been nice is, I think most people in comics probably, if you really want to do it, there's sort of a built-in message inside that says, I'm going to do this. And so you have that as sort of this really strong, just you take for granted, I'll find a way to do this, and you generally do. So, and it worked out fine because the 90s, of course, was a really big boom time for comics, and I got a lot of work. But at some point, probably right around the end of the 90s, it just sort of, you know, the industry changed, I wasn't getting as much work, so it kind of leads to another thought, is I think you really have to be adaptable in the art industry. So for a while, I worked thankfully very briefly at a part-time job, and I got an opportunity to actually go to Oklahoma and work with a guy I used to work with in comics named Terry Tidwell, and he had decided sort of early on to do sort of comic book work for advertising and animation. And you know, for a long time I kind of thought, well, that's not really my thing, I really don't want to do that. But as opposed to actually working a real job, that sounded like pretty good. So I went out there and worked with him for about 5 years, and it was really nice because we ended up doing basically just, it felt like comic books. I mean, it was, for all intents and purposes, it was sequential art a lot of the time. And it was very much just comic book based, but for advertising and for toy companies, Scholastic, etc. But I really missed Omaha. I'm from Omaha, so I really wanted to come back. And so I did that on my own for about 5 years. And then this actually leads to, again, that adaptability idea. That kind of sort of, you know, not pan out so well either. So around 2010, sort of by accident, I got into doing recreations of classic comic book covers. My idea was, well, just for fun, I decided it'd be fun to actually just take Jack Kirby pencils that had never been published and ink them, and just, you know, so I did one for free for like the Jack Kirby collector, and then somebody offered to buy them. I thought, oh, okay. So I kind of started selling them, and I'd sell them on eBay, and you know, they sold okay. And then they started selling like really well. And then I got this request to do just recreations of actual covers that were printed. And I was like, so you want me to take the cover that was actually already done and just recreate it? Yeah. And I've been doing that pretty much full time since. So between that and doing freelance inking here and there on comics and a little advertising here and there. So kind of that idea of whether you get discouraged or where you're going to go on, I think a lot of times it's just how adaptable you can be. You just have to kind of find a way to keep going.
Bruce, would you say you worked at a church running an offset press?
I did.
Picture doing like sneaking in a comic version of the Bible.
I did. Well, I actually used it to print a mini comic of my own. So I asked my wife, is it okay if I use this? And I go, yeah, sure. As long as there's nothing, you know, profane and no.
Most people didn't show up on Sunday accidentally getting the comic instead of
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd like to echo a lot of what Bruce said. I'm sure a lot of you in the crowd are aspiring cartoonists, writers, artists of some kind. If you're committed to being an artist, what you've got to really commit to is trusting your creativity and being able to use that as a tool no matter where it takes you. I describe what I've done over the past 30 years as being a comic book artist, but during that time I've been a storyboard artist for animation, I've designed toys, I've worked in advertising, I've been an editorial cartoonist. But those were really all the same skill set, just aimed in different directions, and it was the skill set of a storyteller, a visual storyteller. So everybody I tell, you know, every time I talk to kids, some of you think you're going to be comic strip artists, but you're going to be video game designers, and some of you think you're going to be animators and you're going to be film directors. You don't know what you're going to be, but if you know how to kindle your own sense of creativity and you trust your skills, that they'll take you where you need to go. And thankfully for me, that's been taking me where I wanted to go in the first place, which was to make comic books. And again, like Bruce said, when you're 20, you never question that. You're like, I'm gonna make comic books, and I'm chugging straight ahead, and everything's gonna be cool. And really, it hasn't caught up to me until about now, till about age 50, and it hit me. You know, guys my age run for president. They don't, they don't worry about getting a ghostwriter annual. But still, the work itself is enough of a balm against that sort of uncertainty that I've never really thought twice about. Also, I'm married to a woman with a great day job. So, but yeah, you hit dark periods, and everybody has ups and downs in their careers. And the thing I'd like to get across to people, maybe on the outside of the industry, is that people you perceive as very successful, sometimes are going through those periods. Even at moments you think, wow, that guy's got it made, or that, she's selling 1 million books on, she's a bestseller. People have crises of not just financial, or they also have creative crises they run into. But as long as you trust that inner storyteller, you'll be okay.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, it took me a long time to break into comics. I mean, I've been wanting to do comics since I was a kid, and I had no idea how to break in. I had no idea, and some people don't like when I use the term breaking into comics. They're like, oh, it feels like you're doing something wrong. Well, I don't care. It feels like you're breaking in. I mean, it feels like breaking in. It took me forever. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to approach editors. I was painfully shy, so at conventions there was no chance of me talking to another creator or another editor. There were a few things I did. As time goes on, I started to get very bitter about it. And I know that if you're an aspiring creator, you know what I'm talking about. You start getting bitter, you start getting angry, and I found there was a moment where I couldn't be happy for my friends when they were having success. And I had, when I realized that, I had to turn that off, and I shut that down. I said, I'd rather not do this than feel bad for people, or feel angry at my friends for succeeding. And that was the first step. Turning that off was a big bonus. It really helped me, because it changed my attitude to a more positive attitude about the industry. And then the other thing is I started treating it like a job. I had a full-time job. I would work all day long. I would work on comics on my breaks and at lunch and whenever I could close the door and nobody was looking. And then I would get home and I would work after about 9 o'clock. I'd work until 1 or 2 in the morning. I would get up about 6 in the morning. I'd work for a couple hours before going to work, and I did that for a couple of years. I've been doing comics now. This is my 10-year anniversary doing comics professionally. And I've been writing comics full time for 6 years. And I remember 2 weeks before I became a full-time writer, I was at a signing. We were signing the Six Gun, which was doing well, but it wasn't making enough money for me to pay my bills doing it. And I looked over at my collaborator, Brian Hurt, and it was just, these things were just constantly going through my head. And we were doing a signing, and it felt like this weight hit me, and I looked over at him and I said, I'll never be able to do this full-time. I said, there's just no way. I can't figure out how to pay insurance. I can't figure out how to, just manage the bills. There's just no way I can do it full-time. And 2 weeks later, I was a full-time writer. And I fought with my boss. I got in that argument with my boss because she didn't think I was as awesome as I thought I was. Spoiler alert, I was right. And I went into my office and I called my wife and I said, would you give me 3 months to try to be a full-time writer? And she said, God bless her, she said yes. And I haven't looked back since. But absolutely, as these guys have said, every day I feel there's always going to be at least, maybe it's just for a second or two, maybe it's for the entire day, but I feel like, this is all going to disappear. I'm not going to continue to get work. But the key of being a professional is I have to keep working through that. Even when I'm feeling that way, I have to keep working or my family doesn't eat. So that's a big motivator for me too.
Just a quick question, do you feel like the personal stuff that you're going through, that struggle, that angst informs your writing and your stories or your art?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's everything that goes on in my life, good or bad, is going to inform what I'm doing when I'm writing stories. I also think, though, like when I was mentioning when I'm feeling bitter and angry at other people, for instance, that was informing it too, and it was poisoning me in terms of being able to work on anything. I was just too angry to do the work. But yeah, everything I do, everything that goes on in my life is going to end up in a comic at some point.
I knew from the time that I was a kid that I wanted to do something with cartoons or comics. I just wasn't sure what it was. And even well into my late 20s, I was having doubts. And I was freelancing and giving my work away and trying to get published wherever I could. But it took me, I eventually realized I wanted to become an editorial cartoonist. And I would go to towns, this is back when more newspapers had full-time cartoonists, but I would go to a town that had a newspaper with no cartoonists, and I would maybe stay with friends, camp out, whatever I could do, and stay there for weeks and draw all these cartoons and then go into the newspaper and try to convince them to hire me. That didn't work, but it took me 9 years to land my job at the World Herald, and even 6 months before that happened, when I was 28 or 29, I was running out of money, and I was a new dad, and I was freelancing cartoons, sports cartoons for the Kansas City Star, making like $25 a cartoon or something. And so I took a job bagging groceries at a grocery store, and I realized I hated that because it was winter and I'd have to carry the groceries outside, so I got on sign duty thinking, okay, maybe my career, this is what the universe is showing me, that I am meant to draw signs in grocery stores. And that's okay, I can use my artwork. not knowing that I was stepping on someone else's toes. And I'll never forget the manager coming in to me and telling me, it was very competitive in the if you want to get into grocery sign making, it's very, very competitive. So I didn't realize I was stepping on someone else's toes by doing this. And the manager came in one day and said, I understand that you have no artistic ability, so you need to go back to bagging groceries. So I quit my job and self-syndicated my work and was later hired to do editorial cartoons. It's a much longer story than that. But I have self-doubt all the time, and coming up with a daily, I'm drawing 5 cartoons a week, not knowing in the morning what I'm going to be drawing later that day can be pretty nerve-wracking. And I also worry that maybe today's the day that it just sort of all goes away.
Six Gun is phenomenal, by the way. It's a fantastic series. But I grew up in Hawaii, and let's see, I've been drawing for about 40 years. And back when I started, you pretty much had to be in New York in order to do comic books. And Hawaii is as far away from New York as you can get and still be in the United States. But it was Jack Kirby that actually was like the first one that actually moved away. He relocated to California. And now pretty much you can work anywhere. Because when I started, there was no internet, there was no fax machines, there's no even FedEx. So, it was hard to break in. But, I've been doing this audio Jimbo for going on 32 years now, and I still have my doubts, but, I've come to the realization that I have no other job skills. And, I love what I do. I'm very blessed. I meet the deadlines. It's what I love, but it's also a business. You have to realize that this is what supports my family, and it pays for my insurance. It pays everything, and the reason I get meet my deadlines every month is because I'm deadly afraid of my editor. And when they say the deadline's due, you better make sure I meet my deadlines. But before comic books, I tried going to syndicating comic strips, and but when I think about the deadlines I have now every 5 weeks, I just could not imagine meeting a deadline every day. It's just the pressure is just so intense. But I love what they do, and I feel very blessed to do it.
I found a really cool niche in comics. There's way less colorists than there are artists and inkers. So, and we have to do a lot volume-wise. But when I was a big fan, and I wanted to do comics when I was in high school and starting to go to college, and I kind of gave up on it, and gave up on myself a little bit in terms of comic book-wise. So I decided to go a weird route and do a different route to where I ended up, but graphic design and commercial illustration. And it's something I really enjoyed. And at some point I moved on a whim to San Diego, packed everything in my car. My friend's sister was going to school down there, and she was gone for the summer, so I had a free place to figure something out. And I accidentally got a job at Wildstorm Comics for a production position. So I totally backdoored my way into comics, and suddenly Jim Lee was standing there, and I was working on the Authority and Planetary, and through those connections, that's how I just kind of maintained that, and then realized, hey, these colorists, they got a pretty good kick. So I went and I made friends with my friend Dave Barron, and just I literally moved into his house and sat behind him for 6 months, and he was coloring JLA at the time, so I just worked and finally got a great position in the book. But it's still scary. Freelance for a living is a scary job, and then you hate to you get to a point where you can't ask too many people for work because suddenly you have to turn down work you're asking for, and it's just it's a really weird position, but it's a great gig.
All right, and we're sort of closing to the end of the first session, so I want to ask one real quick question here. We'll give everybody just a real quick answer, and that is, all of you work in essentially visual storytelling in some way or another. So I think we're all influenced very much by movies. I think movies, I'm guessing a lot of you may love movies. So if you could pick one movie that informs your work, or and I kind of asked this because I was reading a little bit about Stan, reading about some of the movies he watched as a kid. So I'm wondering if you could pick a movie that informs your work at all.
Yeah, as far as my comic strip work, The Sandlot.
Nice.
Actually, probably Yellow Submarine. It was funny because I don't know, I was a big Beatles fan, but there was just something about this combination of the music and the art that just, it was, I'm guessing, kind of like an acid trip. And it's funny, I remember I went with my mom when it came out, and I was just enthralled the entire time, and I found out later she had fallen asleep.
Also, you love to terrify children. That movie does. If you're just one movie, if it's one movie, it's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I was a big spaghetti western, and the visual storytelling is just so like meaty and muscular in that movie. I love Kurosawa movies, and I love Kubrick movies, and Lawrence of Arabia is a big movie for me too. All visual, sweeping kind of films.
I don't want to get too highbrow for everybody. But Big Trouble in Little China is probably a huge influence. Both storytelling, visual, I mean, it's a beautiful movie anyway, but it's a frantic, it's mayhem. And I'd probably say Fifth Element, which isn't a great story, but is such a beautiful movie. I mean, it's one of my favorite movies. I think both of those are huge influences for me, just for the sense of scope and the sense of just, like I said, mayhem in general is amazing to me.
Because my father repaired televisions, there was a TV in every room in our house, and I didn't have a set bedtime. So at a very early age, I was able to watch very inappropriate TV. There was a movie called Wild in the Streets, and it was made in the 60s, and I was probably 7 when I watched it. And the general concept, as I recall, was that when you turned 30, you were sent off to a farm, and that was it. Like 30 was old, and you were done. So there was someone in his 20s running for president, and so it had all these like weird political overtones, and it was kind of a creepy movie. But that would be one of my early political influences, I think.
My big movie is Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. And talk about meeting your heroes, but yeah, I got to meet Toshiro Mifune. Got his autograph hanging on my wall, so it was kind of neat.
This is, for color, I'm going to say for coloring the movie, and it's actually just something it's a recent movie, and I teach a class, it's a master's in comics, and I actually show like 20 minutes of this fight scene from this movie, just because I could teach an entire class on it. It's John Wick. It's not a great movie, but I like it, but it's just all, look at the coloring in it. Just watch it again and look at that, and like how the scenes are done and the lighting, it's really amazing. But it's not the movie that influences my life. Just to let you know.
Great. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this first session and take a little break, and I think we're going to start about 10:10 the next session-ish, 10:05, 10:10, something like that. So take a little stretch break, and thank you guys so much for coming, and let's give a big round of applause for our panelists.